All right, welcome back to the Daily Facts. And we are going to go over the complaint that Sidney Powell dropped against Michigan. So let's get into it. In the United States District Court, Eastern District of Michigan, Timothy King, Marion Ellen Sheridan, John Earl Haggard, Charles James Richard, James David Hooper, and Darren Wade Rubin, plaintiffs, those are the plaintiffs, versus Gretchen Whitmer in her official capacity as governor of the state of Michigan, Jocelyn Benson in her official capacity as Michigan Secretary of State, and the Michigan Board of State Canvassers defendants. Okay, this was filed on November 25th of 2020. It's case number 2:20-CV-13134-LVP RSW. Okay, so let's get into the reading of this complaint. Nature of the action. This civil action brings to light a massive election fraud, multiple violations of the Michigan Election Code, CEG MCL 168.730-738, in addition to the election and electors clauses and equal protection clause of the U.S. Constitution violations that occurred during the 2020 general election throughout the state of Michigan, as set forth in the affidavits of dozens of eyewitnesses and the statistical anomalies and mathematical impossibilities detailed in the affidavits of expert witnesses. The scheme and artifice to defraud was for the purpose of illegally and fraudulently manipulating the vote count to manufacture an election of Joe Biden as President of the United States. The fraud was executed by many means, but the most fundamentally troubling, insidious, and egregious ploy was the systematic adaptation of old-fashioned ballot stuffing. It has now been amplified and rendered virtually invisible by computer software created and run by domestic and foreign actors for that very purpose. This complaint details an especially egregious range of conduct in Wayne County and the city of Detroit, though this conduct occurred throughout the state at the direction of Michigan state election officials. The multifaceted schemes and artifices implemented by defendants and their collaborators to defraud resulted in the unlawful counting or manufacturing of hundreds of thousands of illegal, ineligible, duplicate, or purely fictitious ballots in the state of Michigan that, let's just read this footnote. The same pattern of election fraud and voter fraud writ large occurred in all the swing states, with only minor variations in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Wisconsin. See Exhibit 101, William M. Briggs, PhD, an analysis regarding absentee ballots across several states, November 23rd, 2020. Dr. Briggs report. And 50 USC 20701 requires retention and preservation of records and papers by officers of elections, deposit with custodian, penalty for violation, but as will be sworn wide pattern of misconduct with ballots show preservation of election records have not been kept, and Dominion logs are only voluntary with no system-wide preservation system. Without an incorruptible audit log, there is no acceptable system. Okay, let's continue. Constitute a multiple of Biden's purported lead in the state. While this complaint and the eyewitness and expert testimony incorporated herein identify with specificity sufficient ballots required to overturn and reverse the election results, the entire process is so riddled with fraud, illegality, and statistical impossibility that this court and Michigan voters courts and legislators cannot rely on or certify any numbers resulting from this election. Dominion voting systems fraud and manipulation. The fraud begins with the election software and hardware from Dominion Voting Systems Corporation, Dominion, used by the Michigan Board of State Canvassers. The Dominion systems derived from the software designed by Smartmatic Corporation, which became Sequoia in the United States. Smartmatic and Dominion were founded by foreign oligarchs and dictators to ensure computerized ballot stuffing and vote manipulation to whatever level was needed to make certain Venezuelan dictator Hugo Chavez never lost another election. See Exhibit 1, Redacted Declaration of Dominion Venezuela Whistleblower, Dominion Whistleblower Report. Notably, Chavez won every election thereafter. As set forth in the Dominion Whistleblower Report, the Smartmatic software was contrived through a criminal conspiracy to manipulate Venezuelan elections in favor of dictator Hugo Chavez. Importantly, I was a direct witness to the creation and operation of an electronic voting system in a conspiracy between a company known as Smartmatic and the leaders of conspiracy with the Venezuelan government. This conspiracy specifically involved President Hugo Chavez Frias, the person in charge of the National Electoral Council named Jorge Rodriguez, and principals, representatives, and personnel from Smartmatic. The purpose of this conspiracy was to create and operate a voting system that could change the votes in elections from votes against persons running the Venezuelan government to votes in their favor in order to maintain control of the government. In mid-February of 2009, there was a national referendum to change the constitution of Venezuela to end term limits for elected officials, including the president of Venezuela. The referendum passed. This permitted Hugo Chavez to be reelected an unlimited number of times. Smartmatic's electoral technology was called Sistema de Gestión Electoral, the electoral management system. Smartmatic was a pioneer in this area of computing systems. Their system provided for transmission of voting data over the internet to a computerized central tabulating center. The voting machines themselves had a digital display, fingerprint recognition feature to identify the voter, and printed out the voter's ballot. The voter's thumbprint was linked to a computerized record of that voter's identity. Smartmatic created and operated the entire system. A core requirement of the Smartmatic software design, ultimately adopted by Dominion for the Michigan's elections, was the software's ability to hide its manipulation of votes from any audit. As the whistleblower explains, Chavez was most insistent that Smartmatic design the system in a way that the system could change the vote of each voter without being detected. He wanted the software itself to function in such a manner that if the voter were to place their thumbprint or fingerprint on a scanner, then the thumbprint would be tied to a record of the voter's name and identity as having voted, but that voter would not track to the changed vote. He made it clear that the system would have to be set up to not leave any evidence of the changed vote for a specific voter, and that there would be no evidence to show and nothing to contradict that the name or the fingerprint or thumbprint was going with a changed vote. Smartmatic agreed to create such a system and produce the software and hardware that accomplished that result for President Chavez. The design and features of the Dominion software did not permit a simple audit to reveal its misallocation, redistribution, or deletion of votes. First, the system's central accumulator does not include a protected real-time audit log that maintains the date and timestamps of all significant election events. Key components of the system utilize protected logs. Essentially, this allows an unauthorized user the opportunity to arbitrarily add, modify, or remove log entries, causing the machine to log election events that do not reflect actual voting tabulations, or more specifically, do not reflect the actual votes or the will of the people. See Exhibit 107, August 24, 2020, Declaration of Harry Hursty. Indeed, under the professional standards within the industry in auditing and forensic analysis, when a log is unprotected and can be altered, it can no longer serve the purpose of an audit log. There is incontrovertible physical evidence that the standards of physical security of the voting machines and the software were breached, and machines were connected to the internet in violation of professional standards, which violates federal election law on the preservation of evidence. In deciding to award Dominion a $25 million 10-year contract to a Dominion project team lead by Kelly Garrett, former deputy director of the Michigan Democratic Party, and then certifying Dominion software, Michigan officials disregarded all the concerns that caused Dominion software to be rejected by the Texas Board of Elections in 2018 because it was deemed vulnerable to undetected and non-audible manipulation. An industry expert, Dr. Andrew Apple, Princeton professor of computer science and election security expert, has recently observed, with reference to Dominion voting machines, I figured out how to make a slightly different computer program that just before the polls were closed, it switches some votes around from one candidate to another. I wrote that computer program into a memory chip, and now to hack a voting machine, you just need 7 minutes alone with it and a screwdriver. Plaintiff's expert witness, Russell James Ramsland Jr., Exhibit 101, Ramsland Affidavit, has concluded that Dominion alone is responsible for the injection or fabrication of 289,866 illegal votes in Michigan that must be disregarded. This is almost twice the number of Mr. Biden's purported lead in the Michigan vote, without consideration of the additional illegal, ineligible, duplicate, or fictitious votes due to the unlawful conduct outlined below, and thus by itself is grounds to set aside the 2020 general election and grant the declaratory and injunctive relief requested herein. Let's just read this footnote. Andrew W. Appel, et al. Ballot marking devices, BMDs, cannot assure the will of the votes at December 27, 2019, attached hereto as Exhibit 2, Appel study. In addition to the Dominion computer fraud, this complaint identifies several additional categories of traditional voting fraud and Michigan election code violations, supplemented by healthy doses of harassment, intimidation, discrimination, abuse, and even physical removal of Republican poll challengers to eliminate any semblance of transparency, objectivity, or fairness from the vote counting process. While this legal conduct by election voters, workers, and state, county, and city employees in concert with Dominion, even if it considered in isolation, the following three categories of systemic violations of the Michigan Election Code cast significant doubt on the result of the election and mandate this court to set aside the 2020 general election and grant the declaratory injunctive relief requested herein. Fact witnesses' testimony of voting fraud and other illegal conduct. There were three broad categories of illegal conduct by election workers in collaboration with other employees, state, county, and or city employees, and Democratic poll watchers and activists. First, to facilitate and cover up the voting fraud and counting of fraudulent, illegal, or ineligible voters, election workers, A, denied Republican election challengers access to the TCF Center, where all Wayne County, Michigan ballots were processed and counted. B, denied Republic poll watchers at the TCF Center meaningful access to view ballot handling, processing, or counting, and locked credentialed challengers out of the counting room so they could not observe the process, during which time tens of thousands of ballots were processed. Engaged in a systemic pattern of harassment, intimidation, and even physical removal of Republican election challengers or locking them out of the TCF Center. Systematically discriminated against Republican poll watchers and favored Democratic poll watchers, ignored or refused to record Republican challenges to the violations outlined herein, refused to permit Republican poll challengers to observe ballot duplication and other instances where they allow ballots to be duplicated by hand without allowing poll challengers to check if the duplication was accurate, unlawfully coached voters to vote for Joe Biden and to vote a straight Democrat ballot, including by going over to the voting booths with voters in order to watch them vote and coach them for whom to vote. As a result of the above, Democratic election challengers outnumber Republicans by 2-1 or 3-1, or sometimes 2-0 at voting machines, and collaborated with Michigan State, Wayne County, and or City of Detroit employees, including police, in all of the above unlawful and discriminatory behavior. Second, election workers illegally forged, added, removed, or otherwise altered ballots, information on ballots, the qualified voter file, QVF, and other voting records, including A, fraudulently adding tens of thousands of new ballots and or new voters to QVF in two separate batches on December 4th, 2020, all or nearly all of which were votes for Joe Biden. B, forging voter information and fraudulently adding new voters to the QVF voters, in particular, e.g., when a voter's name could not be found, the election worker assigned the ballot to a random name already in the QVF to a person who had not voted and recorded the new voters shaving a birth date of 1/1/1900. Changing dates on absentee ballots received after 8 p.m. Election Day deadline to indicate that such ballots were received before the deadline. Changing votes for Trump and the Republican candidates and added votes to undervote ballots and removing votes from overvotes. Third, election workers committed several additional categories of violations of the Michigan Election Code to enable them to accept and count other illegal, ineligible, or duplicate ballots or reject Trump or Republican ballots, including A, permitting illegal double voting by persons that had voted by absentee ballot and in person, counting ineligible ballots, and in many cases, multiple times, counting ballots without signatures or without attempting to match signatures, and ballots without postmarks pursuant to direct instructions from defendants, counting spoiled ballots, systemic violations of ballot secrecy requirements, unsecured ballots arrived at the TCF Center loading garage, not in sealed ballot boxes, without any chain of custody, and without envelopes after the 8 p.m. Election Day deadline. In particular, the tens of thousands of ballots that arrived on November 4th, 2020, and accepting and counting ballots from deceased voters. Okay, we're going to stop there and we'll pick up on part two 2 very soon. Thank you for stopping by the Daily Facts. Please do like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, and we'll talk again soon. Bye.